The moment my son squeezed my hand under the table, I felt it. 3 short, sharp pulses. My breath hitched in my throat, but I kept my face as still as stone. We had not used that secret signal since he was 6 years old, and got lost at a crowded state fair. Back then, it was his way of telling me he was scared and needed me to get him out of a situation immediately. Now, he was 22 years old, sitting across from a woman who claimed to be the love of his life. His knuckles were bone white as he gripped the edge of his chair. To anyone else, he looked like a nervous young man in love. To me, he looked like a prisoner sending a coded message from behind enemy lines. The air in the dining room suddenly felt heavy and thin. I could hear the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, sounding like a countdown. My son's eyes met mine for a brief second, and I saw a flash of genuine terror that chilled me to my core. Whatever was happening, it wasn't just a bad date, it was a crisis. The table was set with my grandmother's finest lace cloth, the one I only pull out for special occasions. The rich, savory smell of pot roast and rosemary filled the air, a scent that usually meant comfort and family bonding. On the surface, it was a perfect Sunday afternoon. My husband Mark was busy pouring a heavy Cabernet into crystal glasses, laughing heartily at a joke. We were playing the part of the welcoming parents, hosting our son's new girlfriend for the very first time. Everything looked normal. The candles flickered softly, casting warm shadows on the walls. The silver polish to a mirror shine reflected our smiling faces. But beneath that surface of domestic peace, a storm was brewing. I watched the way the woman sat, perfectly poised, almost too still. She was like a beautiful statue placed in the middle of our lives. My son, Leo, wasn't eating. He just stared at his plate, his hand still vibrating from the force of that hidden signal. I knew I had to keep my cool. I had to be the professional I was trained to be, even if my heart was hammering against my ribs. My name is Diane Finley, and I am 52 years old. For 25 years, I have worked as a Senior Forensic Auditor for the state. My entire career has been built on finding the one decimal point that doesn't belong, or the one signature that looks just a little too perfect. I have spent thousands of hours in cold rooms looking into the eyes of embezzlers, fraudsters, and sociopaths who thought they were smarter than the system. I have learned that people lie with their words, but they rarely lie with their patterns. I am trained to notice the tiny flinch in a muscle or the way a person's tone shifts when they are cornered. Usually, I leave my work at the office, but the second I sat down at this table, my spidey sense went into overdrive. I wasn't just a mother tonight, I was an investigator. I looked at the woman sitting next to my son and felt a cold knot tie itself in my stomach. She was charming, yes, but there was a calculated edge to her warmth that felt like a sharp blade wrapped in silk. I knew I was about to start the most important audit of my life. Those 3 squeezes from Leo meant one thing: get me out of here. My mind started racing through every possible scenario. Leo is a tech prodigy. He's rational, calm, and deeply kind. He doesn't overreact or play games. If he was signaling me during a quiet family dinner, it meant the floor wasn't just shaking. It was about to give way completely. I looked at his face again. He was pale, and a thin bead of sweat stood on his forehead despite the cool breeze coming through the window. He was trapped. I realized then that he couldn't speak freely because she was always watching him. Even when she was talking to my husband, her eyes would flick back to Leo with a strange, possessive intensity. It was the look a predator gives its prey to make sure it doesn't wander off. I had to respond without alerting her. Under the table, I reached out and squeezed Leo's hand back once, firmly. It was our code for "I hear you. Hold steady." I felt his muscles relax, just a tiny bit, but the tension in the room remained thick enough to cut with a knife. The woman's name was Vanessa. She was breathtaking in a way that felt almost engineered. She looked to be in her early 30s, wearing a soft, cashmere sweater that probably cost more than my first car. She was soft-spoken and had an accent I couldn't quite place, something polished and expensive. She told us she worked as an art endowment consultant. She spoke eloquently about democratizing high-value aesthetics and creating fractional ownership of Renaissance pieces for the modern investor. She sounded brilliant, sophisticated, and deeply passionate about her work. Mark was leaning in, completely captivated by her stories of European galleries and secret auctions. She seemed like the perfect match for a bright young man like Leo. She was attentive to my husband's stories and laughed at all the right times. But to my trained ears, she sounded like a brochure. Her sentences were too polished, her anecdotes too perfectly timed. She wasn't having a conversation, she was delivering a sales pitch. I watched her hands as she spoke. They were manicured and steady, never trembling, never showing a hint of the nervousness a normal person feels when meeting their partner's parents. As the meal went on, Vanessa started dropping financial terms into the conversation like they were casual observations. She talked about non-correlated assets, private liquidity pools, and mitigating market volatility through physical hedge pieces. She was subtly pitching a $150,000 seed entry into a new art fund she was managing. My husband, Mark, who loves the idea of being a savvy investor, was nodding along, clearly impressed by her vocabulary. But as she spoke, I started running her words through my mental filter. She never mentioned a specific gallery by name. She never named a registered broker-dealer. She spoke about exclusive opportunities that required immediate action to avoid regulatory friction. In my world, regulatory friction is just a fancy way of saying the law. Every phrase she used was designed to sound sophisticated while actually saying nothing at all. It was classic progressive suspicion. One clue wasn't enough to convict her, but when you layered them on top of each other, a dark picture began to emerge. I watched Leo's face as she talked about the money. He looked sick. He wasn't a partner in this fund, he was the target. The stakes became clear very quickly. Only 2 months ago, Leo had received a significant inheritance from his late grandfather, $200,000 that was strictly intended to pay for his doctorate and set up his future research lab. It was a life-changing amount of money for a young man just starting out. I realized with a jolt of horror that Vanessa hadn't fallen for my son's personality or his brilliant mind. She was hunting a whale in a college hoodie. She had likely spent weeks or months grooming him, making him feel special while slowly isolating him from his own judgment. The $150,000 she was asking for would effectively wipe out his entire future. My husband didn't know the specifics of the inheritance yet, so he just saw a bright woman offering a great business deal. But I knew that if she walked out of this house with his trust, my son would be left with nothing but debt and a broken heart. This wasn't just a scam, it was a calculated attempt to steal a young man's entire life before it had even truly begun. I felt a surge of protective fury, but I kept my smile in place. The Basel auction window closes this Tuesday, Vanessa said, reaching over to touch Leo's arm with a lingering, gentle pressure. It looked romantic, but I saw it for what it was. A reminder. If we don't wire the commitment fee by tomorrow morning, the slot goes to a group in Singapore. It's a once-in-a-decade window, Diane. I'd hate for Leo to miss out on the ground floor of something this significant. There it was. The artificial urgency trigger. Every scammer uses it. They create a fake deadline to stop the victim from thinking logically or asking for a second opinion. They want you to move fast so you don't notice the holes in the story. She was leaning on him, using their supposed relationship as leverage to force a financial decision. Tomorrow is very soon, I said calmly, taking a slow sip of my water. I watched her eyes. For a split second, a flash of irritation crossed her face before the mask of the charming girlfriend slid back into place. Great things don't wait for the hesitant, she replied with a small, knowing smile. I knew then that I had less than 18 hours to save my son. I didn't argue with her. I didn't point out the red flags or demand to see her credentials. That would have only made her defensive, and might have pushed Leo to protect her if he was still under her spell. Instead, I played the part of the impressed mother. I smiled, offered her more wine, and asked her more about the artistic vision of the fund. I acted as though I was completely bought into her charm, but beneath the table I reached out and squeezed Leo's hand again. One firm pulse. I've got you. Just hold on. I saw a tiny bit of color return to his cheeks. He knew I was on the case. For the rest of dinner, I became a silent observer, recording every detail of her appearance, her jewelry, and the way she checked her phone when she thought no one was looking. I noticed a small tattoo on the inside of her wrist that she tried to keep covered with her sweater sleeve. It was a small, faded bird. I memorized it. When the dinner finally ended and they stood up to leave, I hugged her warmly. I needed to get close enough to smell her perfume and see if there were any other clues. The second their car pulled out of the driveway, the mom mask fell off. I didn't even wait for Mark to finish clearing the dishes. I went straight to my home office and locked the door. My husband knocked once, confused by my sudden departure, but I told him I had an urgent work deadline. I didn't want to involve him yet. He was too close to the situation and too charmed by Vanessa. I pulled out my phone and called Eugene. Eugene is a former FBI agent who now works as a high-end private investigator. We had worked together on several state cases, and I trusted him with my life. I also sent an encrypted message to Sloan, a specialist art appraiser I had helped during a complex tax evasion case a few years back. I need an immediate background check on a woman named Vanessa, I told Eugene, giving him the description and the details of the art fund. I also mentioned the bird tattoo. And Sloan, I need to know if there's a Basel auction window closing this Tuesday for a fractional art fund. Then I sat in the dark and waited for the data to start flowing in. By 3 a.m., my computer screen was glowing with the ugly truth. Eugene called me back, his voice low and serious. Diane, your Vanessa is actually a woman named Victoria Vance. She doesn't do art. She does romance scams for high net worth heirs and young men with sudden inheritances. She's a pro. She has at least 3 different aliases and a trail of broken bank accounts and devastated families from Connecticut to Chicago. He sent over a file of police reports. In every case, she used the same tactic: a whirlwind romance, a once-in-a-lifetime investment, and a sudden disappearance once the wire transfer cleared. Sloan's email arrived minutes later. There is no Basel window for fractional funds this week, Diane. That's a total fabrication. Anyone asking for a wire transfer tomorrow is a thief. My heart hurt for Leo. He wasn't just losing money. He was being used by a professional predator who had likely researched his grandfather's death and his financial status before ever accidentally meeting him at that coffee shop. The pattern was undeniable. She was a ghost who left nothing but ruin behind her. I realized that a simple police report wouldn't be enough to stop her. Victoria Vance was an expert at vanishing. If she saw a squad car near Leo's apartment, she'd be on a plane to another state before they could even knock on the door. To catch her, I needed her to believe she had already won. I needed her to walk right into a trap of her own making. I waited until 6 a.m. and called Leo. I told him everything. I heard him sob quietly on the other end of the line, the sound of a young man's heart breaking as the reality of the betrayal hit him. She told me she loved me, Mom, he whispered. She talked about our future house. It was agonizing to hear, but I had to keep him focused. I know, honey. And that's why we're going to make sure she never does this to anyone else. I laid out the plan. It was a sting operation, but it required him to play the role of the devoted, eager boyfriend for just a few more hours. He took a deep breath, and I heard his voice turn to ice. Let's finish this, he said. Mom, Leo said, his voice still trembling slightly. She made me feel like I was the only person in the world. How could someone act that well? How could she look me in the eye every day and plan to destroy me? This was the hardest part of the investigation, the emotional conflict. In my job, I usually deal with numbers on a screen, but here, the victim was my own flesh and blood. The betrayal wasn't just about the $150,000. It was a soul theft. She had stolen his ability to trust, his first real experience of adult love, and replaced it with a nightmare. I felt a cold, hard anger growing inside me. This woman hadn't just targeted a bank account, she had targeted my son's kindness. I told him that people like Victoria Vance don't have hearts, they have appetites. They don't see people, they see opportunities. I promised him that we would turn that appetite against her. We spent the next hour rehearsing exactly what he would say when she woke up. He had to be perfect. He had to be the whale she thought he was until the very last second. Monday morning arrived with a gray, biting chill. We invited Vanessa to my office under the guise of finalizing the wire transfer in a secure environment. I told her I wanted to help Leo with the paperwork since I was an auditor and could ensure everything was tax compliant. She jumped at the chance, likely thinking that having the mother's approval would make the theft even easier. What she didn't know was that my office was now a fortress of surveillance. I had a high-definition hidden camera tucked inside a large succulent pot on my bookshelf, and a professional-grade digital recorder hidden beneath my leather desk blotter. Eugene was in the building next door, monitoring the feeds in real time. 2 plainclothes detectives were stationed in the break room just down the hall. I sat behind my desk, the same desk where I had caught dozens of criminals before, and waited for the predator to walk into my den. When she arrived, she was wearing a sharp blazer and carrying a slim leather briefcase. She looked like the CEO of a successful future. I stood up and greeted her with a smile that felt like a mask. Vanessa, or Victoria, was incredibly smug. She laid out the contracts on my desk with a flourish. They were beautiful documents, embossed with gold foil and filled with complex legal jargon that meant absolutely nothing. I began to ask her questions, playing the part of the careful but impressed mother. I asked her point blank about the SEC filings for the fund and why the wire instructions pointed to a holding company in the Cayman Islands. She didn't even blink. She laughed softly, a sound that now sounded like grating metal to me. Diane, at this level of wealth, we often bypass the usual red tape for the sake of agility. It's all about trust and speed. She then leaned in and admitted with a conspiratorial wink that the funds would go to a temporary holding account, in her own name just to expedite the auction bid. She was confessing to a felony, thinking she was just closing a deal with a suburban mom. She was so overconfident that she stopped being careful. She was practically bragging about how easy it was to move the money. I kept nodding, my hand hovering near the send button on my phone. The tension in the room was almost unbearable. I could see Leo sitting in the corner, his face a mask of practiced neutrality. Finally, I stood up and walked toward the door. "I just need to grab the authorization stamp from the front desk," I said. That was the signal. I didn't go to the front desk. I opened the door and let in Eugene and the 2 detectives. Vanessa's face didn't just drop, it turned a sickly shade of gray. The smugness evaporated instantly, replaced by a frantic, darting look as she searched for an exit. There was nowhere to go. "Victoria Vance," the lead detective said, "you are under arrest for grand larceny and multiple counts of wire fraud." As the handcuffs clicked shut over her expensive cashmere sleeves, she didn't scream or cry. She just went cold. She looked at me with a hatred so pure it was startling. "You think you're so smart, Diane?" she hissed. "You're just a bored auditor in a cheap suit." I didn't respond. I just watched as they led her away. It was narrative justice at its finest. The first peak of the mountain had been cleared. The story should have ended there. We watched the police car drive away with Victoria in the back seat. Leo fell into my arms, shaking with the release of months of built-up pressure. Mark, who had arrived just as the arrest happened, was stunned and kept apologizing for being so easily fooled. We went back to our house, and I cooked another dinner, just the 3 of us this time. We ate roast chicken and talked about how lucky we were that we caught it in time. I felt a sense of peace, a feeling that the world had been set right. We talked about Leo's future and how he could now go to his doctorate program without a shadow hanging over him. I felt like the hero of the story. I had saved my son, protected our family, and put a dangerous criminal behind bars. We laughed, we cried, and we went to bed feeling safe for the first time in weeks. But as I lay in the dark, my auditor's brain wouldn't stop clicking. Something about the contracts Vanessa had brought to my office was still bothering me. Something didn't add up. The next morning, I went back to my office to clean up the files Vanessa had left behind. I started reviewing the digital footprint on the USB drive she had used to show us the art gallery photos. Because I am a forensic auditor, I don't just look at the files. I look at the metadata, the hidden data that tells you who created the document and when. As I dug deeper, I found a deleted folder that hadn't been fully scrubbed. It contained a set of wire instructions for a holding account that wasn't in Victoria's name. It was a joint account. My breath stopped as I looked at the name of the cosigner. It wasn't another alias, it was a name I recognized instantly, It was Julian, our family lawyer and my husband's best friend for 20 years. My heart didn't just sink. It felt like it had been dropped into an abyss. This wasn't just a romance scam by a stranger. It was an inside job. The shadow partner was the man who sat at our Thanksgiving table every single year. I sat in silence for a long time, the glow of the computer screen mocking me. Julian wasn't just our lawyer. He was the person who had handled the legal side of my father-in-law's estate. He was the only one besides us who knew exactly how much Leo had inherited and exactly when the funds would be available. He was the architect. He had recruited Victoria Vance, providing her with all the personal details she needed to accidentally meet Leo and win his heart. He was planning to take a 50% cut of the $150,000 for legal sheltering and offshore management. The betrayal was deeper than I could have ever imagined. The man who had held Leo as a baby was the same man who had helped a predator hunt him. I felt a wave of nausea. This was the real story, the one hidden behind the flashy art fund and the cashmere sweaters. Julian thought he was safe because Victoria was the face of the crime. He thought he could stay in the shadows and collect his fee while we picked up the pieces of Leo's broken life. I knew I couldn't tell Mark yet. Julian was like a brother to him, and Mark wasn't trained to hide his emotions. If he found out, he would confront Julian immediately, and Julian would destroy any remaining evidence. I had to play the long game. I had to perform a double sting. I contacted the State Bar Association and the Financial Crimes Division of the State Police, providing them with the metadata I had recovered. I told them I wanted to catch the clean partner in the act. I called Julian and told him the good news, that we had caught the scammer who tried to trick Leo. I invited him over for celebratory drinks, to thank him for all the legal advice he had given us over the years. I told him we wanted to discuss setting up a new trust for Leo's money now that we knew how dangerous the world could be. Julian sounded delighted on the phone. "I'll be there at 7, Diane. I'm so glad the boy is safe." His voice was warm, oily, and utterly terrifying. That evening, Julian arrived at our house with a bottle of expensive champagne. He hugged Mark, clapped Leo on the back, and sat in his favorite leather armchair as if he owned the place. He played the part of the relieved family friend perfectly. "You did a great thing, Diane," he said, raising his glass. "Most people wouldn't have been so sharp." I smiled and handed him a thank you gift, a thick manila folder. "I wanted you to have the first look at the final report I'm filing with the state regarding the Vance case," I said. Julian opened the folder, expecting to see a summary of Victoria Vince's crimes. Instead, his eyes landed on the bank records showing his own signature alongside Victoria's alias. He saw the wire transfer logs from the joint account. He saw the emails he had sent her from a burner account, detailing Leo's bank balance. The color didn't just drain from his face. It looked like his soul had exited his body. The champagne glass trembled in his hand, the bubbles hissing in the sudden dead silence of the room. "I'm a forensic auditor, Julian," I said, my voice as cold as a winter morning. "I don't just find the fraud, I find the person who signed for it. I found the offshore account you've been hiding from, your wife too. I found everything." Julian tried to laugh, but it came out as a desperate wet wheeze. He looked at Mark, who was now standing up, his face filled with a confusion that was rapidly turning into rage. "Diane, let's be reasonable," Julian whispered. "This is a misunderstanding. I was trying to protect the money from her." I cut him off. "You have 10 minutes to sign a full confession and a voluntary resignation from the bar, or I send this entire folder to the federal prosecutors and your wife. And believe me, the feds are already waiting for my call." I placed a pen and a prepared statement on the coffee table. He looked like a trapped animal, his eyes darting around the room, realizing that his 20-year charade was over. The man who thought he was the smartest person in the room was now the smallest. Julian looked at the pen, then back at me. A strange, twisted smile touched his lips. He realized he was caught, but he wanted to take one last shot. "You think you're so clever, Diane? You think this was just about Leo's little inheritance?" He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a hiss. "While you were so busy playing hero and tracking Victoria, did you ever wonder why your own retirement fund hasn't grown in 3 years? I was the one who managed your 401k, remember? Victoria was just the distraction. She was the shiny object to keep you looking one way while I authorized a rebalancing of your entire life's savings. By the time the police finish with her, your accounts will be as empty as your husband's head. He laughed then, a sharp, jagged sound. I didn't need Leo's money. I already had yours. Mark let out a cry of disbelief, but I stayed perfectly still. This was the final twist, the moment where the villain thinks he has the ultimate upper hand. He thought he had gutted my future while I was trying to save my son's. I didn't flinch. I didn't cry. I actually leaned back in my chair and took a slow, deliberate sip of my tea. I know about the rebalancing, Julian, I said calmly. In fact, I've known for 3 weeks. Why do you think I was so distracted by Vanessa? I needed you to feel confident enough to actually initiate those transfers. Julian's laugh died in his throat. What are you talking about? I smiled. The real smile of a predator who had finally closed the trap. 3 weeks ago, when I first smelled your specific cologne in my home office and noticed my files had been moved, I moved my entire portfolio into a blind trust. I replaced my actual account numbers with a honeypot account set up by the state police. You didn't authorize a transfer of my money, Julian. You authorized a transfer into a monitored government server. You didn't just steal. You self-incriminated in real time on a federal network. Every keystroke you made is now a felony count. You weren't stealing my future. You were building your own prison cell. The silence that followed was absolute. Julian looked at the pen on the table as if it were a deadly snake. Outside, the blue and red lights of the police cars began to flash against the living room curtains. They didn't even need to knock. I had already unlocked the door remotely. Julian was let out in handcuffs on my front porch, in full view of the entire neighborhood he had tried so hard to impress. A week later, Leo and I sat at the same dining table. There were no guests, no scammers, and no crooked lawyers. Just us and a simple plate of pasta. Leo reached over, took my hand, and squeezed it 3 times. The code red was gone. This time I knew exactly what it meant. Thank you for saving me. I reached back and squeezed his hand 4 times, a new code we had made just for us. It meant, I've always got you. My son smiled, a real bright smile that reached his eyes, and I knew that while we had lost a friend and a lot of sleep, we had gained something much more valuable. The truth. The auditor in me was finally satisfied. The books were balanced. If you were in Diane's shoes and realized your husband's best friend of 20 years was the one behind the scam, would you have confronted him at the dinner table like she did? Or would you have gone straight to the police without saying a word? What would you have done? If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, don't miss the next one. Click the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a breakdown of the world's most sophisticated scams and the brilliant minds that bust them.